My name is Jonathan Andrew again, for those of you who just joined, and I'm a client success manager at Akoya. And for those of you who are not aware, Akoya's goal is to transform the way that consumers share their data by providing consumers with increased security, transparency, and control over their information. But today, our focus is not going to be on Akoya in particular. As you may have noticed, we're talking about digital trust today. And with me, I have Bhaskar Chakravorti, who's the Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. This is a very exciting session for me. I am an alumni and graduate of the International Business Program at Fletcher, and Bhaskar has had to put up with me on many occasions. I was his TA for a class. Bhaskar is also a professor of practice in international business. And so I'm really excited to have him with us today to talk about digital trust. In addition to being the Dean of Global Business at Fletcher, Bhaskar is also the Executive Director of Fletcher's Institute for Business in the Global Context. And the IBGC, that institute, has put out quite a bit of research over the last few years, the most recent of which is on digital trust, which we'll get into in a bit of detail today. A little bit more information about Bhaskar before I pass it over to him. Bhaskar joined Fletcher in 2011, and prior to that, he was a partner of McKinsey and Company. He was a partner at McKinsey and Company, and he was also the leader of McKinsey's Innovation and Global Forces practice. He also served on the faculty of Harvard Business School. He is a distinguished scholar at MIT's Legatum Center. He earned a PhD in economics from the University of Rochester. Is a graduate of the Delhi School of Economics and Delhi St. Stephen's College. Just a reminder again, the way the format of this session is Bhaskar is going to give a bit of a presentation on digital trust. Once that's concluded, I have a few questions. He agreed, and I said it was okay that I only lob him softballs on this call today. But please feel free to give him the hard-hitting questions in the Q&A as we go through this. And at the end of our session, we'll wrap up with some Q&A from you all as well. So without any further ado, Bhaskar, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, Jonathan, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for this opportunity to do a little bit of a reunion here. And I think what we agreed on was whatever questions that come by, you will give me the softball questions. And after that, you will have a separate TA session where all the difficult questions are going to be addressed. So I hope you're prepared with.
Fair enough, Bhaskar. We can set that up as well.
Yeah, I mean, this relationship, is not going to end. I'm sorry, my friend. You're stuck with all the hard questions for the rest of your life. But if there's anybody that I would trust with the hard questions, it would be you. So I feel pretty good about this. So listen, I think, we would normally be doing this, seeing each other face to face. And here we are having conversations about digital trust while we are trusting the digital medium, to somehow allow us to have an exchange. And I genuinely mean an exchange. While, I have brought my inner consultant with me. And as I was mentioning to you before, consultants believe in the notion of power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. So I do have my absolute corruption machine with me, but I don't feel any compunction or any compelling reason to kind of march through everything. However, I am very proud of practically every single page that I have put together. Not because I'm proud of having put those pages together, but what the content of those pages. The content comes from years of work that we've been doing at Digital Planet at the Fletcher School. And just by way of quick background, this is work that is done by your compatriots, Jonathan, our students. We have an absolutely fantastic a group of student researchers who have done some amazing work, which I am just so proud to share with this group. And this is work that I feel is enormously important in us, trying to get a handle on the world. As of course, we knew that we were going digital long before this pandemic came upon us. But in the last 12 months, last 14 months, the world as we know it has been shrunken to this, a digital world. And of course, there's a lot that's happening outside the digital domain, but practically every one of us is hanging on to several aspects of our lives using the digital tether. And so this has almost given us a lab setting for understanding, how we live our lives on the internet. And it's a test not only of the internet, the purest test of the internet, but in many ways, I say it's the purest test of us as human beings. And so with that, let me share my screen, and we can use that as a sort of a conversation piece. And I hope my screen is visible. And so what I wanted to share with you is, yet another Zoom screen. And of course, once we got down this path just a little over a year ago, where we started interacting at work, school, and play, and everywhere else in between, on screens, we accelerated by 5 years within the first couple of months of the pandemic. Our lives advanced in ways that we couldn't have imagined. And one of the first things we did at Fletcher was trying to understand how countries around the world were prepared to go into a socially distanced mode. And we took several different criteria as ways to kind of calibrate that. And one criterion was that all transactions were going to happen over the internet to the extent possible. And if it's an economic transaction, in one direction of the transaction is going to be a payment. And that payment is going to be contactless in some way. And that contactless nature, kind of suggested to us that there is a need to understand how ready countries around the world are to enable digital payments. And then, of course, we understand that the internet infrastructure, we weren't really sure whether the infrastructure could take the spikes in traffic, whether it was people simultaneously going on Zoom calls all at one time, or people simultaneously streaming the same Netflix video, because, what else are you going to do in the evenings? And then there were all these platforms that were going to help us lead our lives, whether it's platforms like Zoom or platforms like Amazon, which were going to enable us to stay away from retail and still get the benefits of retail in our homes, and all kinds of other platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, to just communicate and get a sense of the world outside. And we ended up being able to organize. We track a large number of countries around the world, and here are how different countries around the world mapped out in terms of their their digital readiness, as it were. And what we saw was, I think the Y, the vertical axis has got cut out here, but really the vertical axis is the readiness of the digital platforms in the different countries. The horizontal axis is the resilience of in the internet infrastructure to spikes in traffic. And the colors on those dots represent how ready you are to go into a digital payment mode. And the bluer the dot, the more ready you are. So I found it interesting that, pretty much to the top right of the page, countries that were more internet ready and more digital platform ready were also the countries that were digital payment ready. So it's really kind of interesting that, strong correlation across all of these, which suggested that there were some countries, from March 2020 on, that were a little bit more ready to be remote. And today, I pulled up this data from our team, which basically kind of lays out every country that we study, 90 countries around the world, and how much digital uptake there has been in terms of payments over the course of the last year. And of course, you can't read what's at the bottom of the chart. At the extreme right-hand side of the chart, the tallest spike is China. The tallest spike is China. The spike right after that is South Korea. On the extreme left-hand side is Morocco and Egypt. And you can see all the other countries in the world, kind of laid out somewhere in between. And what have we seen across the world is a whole bunch of behavior changes that I'm sure doesn't come as a surprise to any of us, even if we haven't been studying this stuff or working in the industry. Cash is down, fintech apps are up, crypto use is up. It's interesting on that last point, crypto use. You see, that's where the dollar has been sinking over the course of 2020, and that's Bitcoin over dollar. So you can see, people, looking for alternatives, and whether it's gold or this alternative. So we are beginning to experience a whole bunch of changes in this pandemic window. And one of the questions that is, I'm sure, on everyone's mind is how many of these changes are going to stick, going as we look ahead. The last major global crisis, the global financial crisis of 2008, gave birth to a whole bunch of things. It gave birth to the fintech industry as we know it. It gave birth to a number of sort of data-driven applications in financial services and other industries. It gave birth to crypto in many ways. And big question, I'm sure, on many people's minds is, what is this turning point going to give birth to? As we kind of looked at, how did payments, in different parts of the world get affected in individual sectors? And again, no surprise, we saw, box office sales, and this is just the data from the UK, box office sales down, restaurant bookings down, tourism down, daily footfall in retail establishments down. And that has an impact on the overall state of the economy. In fact, that's something we picked up in, as I mentioned, I can kill you with PowerPoint, but there's going to be just a lot of data that I can share with you. But I'm assuming that this is an audience that is awash in data, and perhaps they're sort of comfortable, telling stories and data. So you can stop me anytime and say, enough already, let's get to a conversation. But this is kind of another really interesting piece of analysis that I thought, I found quite remarkable. And I thought I'd sort of share it with you at the start. And I'll tie this back to what I just said before. So on the question that we wanted to ask was, if a country is relatively more advanced, relatively more evolved in terms of its digital state, does that buffer that country or that nation or that economy from the economic downturn that is inevitable through a pandemic? And so we studied this phenomenon, and what we tried to understand is there a connection between the two? And what we saw was that digital evolution actually does have a contributory impact on the economic resilience of the country. And on the vertical is a measure of economic resilience. On the horizontal is a measure of digital evolution of a country. And what you can see is all the countries that are kind of on the top right-hand side corner are the highly digitally evolved countries that are also experienced a degree of economic resilience. Now you can see the United States is up there. And those of us who live in the United States may not feel that this country was that economically resilient, but relative to the global economy, it turned out the US was more resilient than others. So there's definitely a connection between economic resilience and digital advancement. However, that's not felt universally. So, and this is where the data from the last page sort of comes in. So let me just call out 3 countries which were in sort of interesting places. So the United Kingdom, it actually bucks that trend. The United Kingdom, according to our measures, is actually a very digitally evolved country. However, its economy wasn't as resilient to the pandemic. And what was going on? As it turns out, a big chunk of the UK economy is reliant on footfalls. It's reliant on people going to football games, as they call it, or cricket games, or they're highly reliant on restaurant traffic, people going to theaters, people transiting through the United Kingdom. Heathrow is one of the biggest transit points in the world. And all of that, pretty much froze, as you saw from the previous data. And what that did was, despite the digital strengths of the United Kingdom, its economy shrank considerably. Very different from its neighbor, Ireland, which is pretty much as digitally evolved as the United Kingdom. But so much of Ireland's economy is digitized. In fact, it's the most digital economy in the EU. And you can see that Ireland's economic resilience was pretty steady. And another country that I think is really interesting to compare this with is South Korea, which maintained its economic resilience, but in a way that was quite kind of different from the way Ireland did this thing. So if you look at South Korea, you'll see that it's a tiny little red dot. I mean, it's hard to see because I just put a box up there. But if I go back, you'll see South Korea is a tiny red dot on the top of the screen right there. And Ireland is a big, fat, dark dot there. And what that is picking up is the degree of social distancing that was maintained across these countries. So the fatter, the darker the dot, the greater the degree of social distancing in the country. And South Korea, as it turns out, didn't maintain as much social distancing as Ireland did. And one of the reasons why they did that, they managed to do that, is they used their digital advancement to actually monitor the COVID status of people around the country by integrating data from multiple sources, from credit card transactions, from mobility information, from your transit information. Your COVID positivity status was part of a public database, and all of that was used to send notifications to every citizen across the country. And because of that incredible level of surveillance in South Korea, people felt comfortable kind of knowing, okay, I'm safe here, I'm not safe there, and they sort of went about their day-to-day business and somehow maintained a semblance of life pre-pandemic. So really interesting to see these different parameters play out. And the reason why I tell this long story is that when we try to understand digital trust or trust in financial services, that cannot be separated from trust in everything else around us. And this last year and counting has been a year when our trust in practically everything, digital and non-digital, has been tested in ways that we have never experienced before. And hopefully, maybe we won't have to, let's hope that we don't have to experience again. But this is a time when we think about trust in digital payments and digital financial services is embedded in a much larger story of trust. And that's the direction that I wanted to take this discussion, Jonathan. And once again, as I warned you, you should stop me anytime. And if there's a question that pops up or something that you'd like to stop me and ask me, let's just do that, okay? Because I don't want to keep going on forever. But just to kind of remind everybody that, of course, this is not just about payments. Children were studying, over the digital medium. Here's a girl in India studying, getting her school lessons over WhatsApp. People were visiting their doctors on their computer screens. People were dating on their screens. Interestingly, despite a year of social distancing, dating apps had a field day. Go figure. Of course, sadly, people said goodbye on screen. So many people did not see their loved ones as they breathed their last, and this too is part of our reality. Now, we at the Digital Planet, the Fletcher School, we think of ourselves as, the equivalent of those medieval map makers, who were trying to figure out the contours of the world and trying to figure out where are the land masses and where's the water. And in many places, we kind of didn't know what there was, and you just say, here there be dragons. You kind of put a mark somewhere over there. We kind of feel that's where we are in our understanding of the digital planet. And we are trying to figure out the contours of this digital planet. And there are many places where there be dragons. And no, those dragons are not Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey or all the people who, there are lots of dragons, and one of the dragons are us. It's, we are the dragons, as are the digital titans, as are, so-called digital enemies, people who are hacking into our systems, from distant lands, or maybe from our own neighborhood, because that ultimately brings together the paradox of our relationship with digital technology. We are more reliant on these technologies. We have spent more time on them, pandemic or otherwise. We will continue to spend more time on them, and yet our trust in these systems have just gone down. Their trust in these systems have gone down partly because we're spending more time on them, partly because we understand even less about what's happening behind that screen, and partly because there's a narrative that has now developed, which is, there's lots of things that we should be worried about, whether those issues have to do with the quality of the information that comes through, whether it has to do with geopolitical concerns, whether it has to do with people worried about this country spying into that country's systems, or it's just pure old cybersecurity concerns. All of them have converged, and of course we get even more concerned when some of the most critical aspects of our lives are put into these systems. So I put my credit card information into these systems. So pre-pandemic, for a lot of people, there were only a few apps into which people put their credit card information. Maybe it was an Uber or some other kind of a ride-sharing kind of app. Today, people have their credit card information into delivery apps, into websites of restaurants, and it's just sort of proliferated, that embedded payment notion. So our concerns about this digital edifice has just gone up as this edifice has become taller and taller, it's become more rickety. We have, of course, been trying to understand how humanity as a whole has been living life on a pandemic. We can give you all the top sites that people have been visiting over the course of the past year. No surprise that Google, YouTube, and Facebook are the top 3 sites that people spend time on. It turns out that they also spend time on Amazon and Wikipedia, which actually are not in the top. Wikipedia is in the top 12, not in the top 10, which is not a bad thing because a lot of children are doing their work at home, and Wikipedia is a go-to place. I'd also say, just to kind of balance this out, there are 2 adult sites in the top 10 around the world. Again, no surprise. And then you have all the other apps, and I can keep going in terms of the what that is telling us about ourselves, and where are we spending more time on financial apps, on knowledge apps, on entertainment apps. It's telling us about where we are today and where we might be going in the future. We also did some really interesting studies on how did people feel as they went into lockdown. So in fact, the first 6 months of a lockdown around the world, we have actually got some fascinating pieces of data on, are people feeling happy or sad or angry about their lives as the government and the public health authorities have pushed them home. And it's really interesting to see what we're finding around the world. So hard to read this graph. There are 4 countries out of several that we have studied: South Africa, South Korea, India, New Zealand. The yellow spikes, that just shows social media posts. This is out of a sentiment analysis of hundreds of trillions of posts that we have sort of picked up. And the different sentiments that we are capturing are surprise, sadness, happiness, fear, disgust, and anger. The yellow is happiness, and the sadness is the blue. So those are the 2 that I'll call your attention to. Anger is the red. And you can see that it's very interesting. Most of these countries, you can see a fair amount of happiness, riding along those charts. And we can actually correlate them with different events that happened. And this is the time frame is January through July of 2020. And so as people were going into this incredibly uncertain period where they really didn't know whom to trust and what to trust, whether it's financial services or the government or the public health authorities, people were trying to find an outlet in stories and jokes and so on and so forth. And you can see a significant amount of happiness sort of peaking across these curves. And then you come to the United States, which is not a happy country at all. It's actually sadness, which is riding the top of social media in the United States. So what's going on here? Now, why do I share this? The reason why I share this is trust is this nebulous thing. Trust is something that draws upon multiple emotions. So it's really important to not take a mechanical view of trust. It's influenced by many different things. How am I feeling? Am I feeling angry or happy or sad or so on? So all these things matter in terms of our understanding of trust. And of course, stepping back and asking the question, how evolved are the different countries? I showed you some graphs in terms of how advanced different countries are. I just wanted to take a minute to share with you how that graph was developed, we created an index called the Digital Evolution Index, which looks at 90 countries around the world, trying to understand how these countries are making a journey from a physical past to a digital future. Over 250 different variables went into the sausage making machine, and the sausage that comes out of the other end is a simple way to try and capture a really complicated reality, which is how digitally advanced are we as a country or as a society. And so very quickly, vertical axis going from south to north, the further to the north you are, the more digitally evolved you are. Left to right on the horizontal tries to measure how quickly you're evolving. How fast is your society changing from traditional to digital? And whole bunch of different patterns pop out. And you can split this whole very complicated picture into 4 quadrants. The top right quadrant are the countries that are firing on all cylinders. They're strong in terms of digital evolution. They're strong in terms of digital momentum. These are the countries that we call the standout countries. They're countries like Singapore, they're countries like South Korea, they're countries like the UAE, they're countries like Malaysia, Hong Kong, but also the United States. The United States is right up there, right there. Standout countries. Then the stall-out countries, these are the countries that are highly digitally advanced, but they have slowed down. They essentially are digitally mature and have developed digital arthritis. And that also has a whole bunch of implications for how people behave in those countries. Much of Europe is up there. And then you have the countries to the bottom left over here, which are the ones that we call the watch out countries. These are, they have a lot of room for development on both fronts, both in state and rate. And then the countries that are some of the most exciting countries in the world from all kinds of perspectives, because they have a ton of unfulfilled potential and they're moving very quickly. The country at the far right, of course, is China. But then there are a whole bunch of others showing an enormous amount of digital speed. And surprisingly, Azerbaijan, not so surprisingly, Vietnam, not so surprisingly, Indonesia, and not so surprisingly, India, and surprisingly, Iran. These are moving very, very fast. So if you're thinking about the global landscape of digital transformation, this is our medieval map of the digital planet. And hopefully this provides a grounding for anybody who's trying to understand how this stuff works around the world, how quickly people are moving, and what the state is. One other factor that I'd like you to keep in mind is that if I were to weight this by population, much of the world's population would land up in the bottom right-hand side of this picture. And if I were to add a weight to it, this entire graph would just sink to the right. So that is also another measure many businesses take into account, because now we're also looking at fast-growing countries, potentially ones where you run businesses, whether it's financial businesses or other businesses, at a low margin, but you hope to make it up with high volume. And you can see how this could play out in the digital sphere. Now, simultaneously, as countries are making this journey from a traditional to a digital future, there's the question of trust. How much trust is there in the system? Now, as I mentioned, as we all understand, trust is not that easy to capture or calibrate. So what we did was we said, look, trust actually can manifest in many different ways. How trustworthy is the environment, the entire digital ecosystem? Are there protocols in place? Are there cybersecurity defenses in place? Are there password systems and so on and so forth in place? Second is how trustworthy or trust engendering is the experience that consumers have. When I complete a financial transaction, is it done quickly? Do I get a confirmation email? And am I feeling that this is done securely? The payment has gone through. A third factor is how trusting is the behavior that people exhibit. Do people show that they trust digital forms of transaction, digital payments? And finally, attitudes. How trusting is the attitude? If you ask somebody, hey, do you trust making a payment using PayPal or using some other a crypto system? The answer they give you could be quite different from their behavior. So we try to capture all these in all across these different lenses. Now, I know that I am extremely conscious of the fact that I have poured an enormous amount of data on you. So I want to pause here and simply note that environment, experience, attitudes, and behaviors depending on how you ask the question, trust varies enormously. So if we just look at the United States, that's where the United States is in terms of the trustworthiness of the environment. The light purple suggests that it's somewhere in between in terms of trustworthiness of the environment. A very dark circle suggests that it is highly trustworthy. A small red dot suggests that it's not trustworthy. So the United States is somewhere in between in terms of environment. Similarly, if I asked for experience, the United States, the experience that consumers have is actually highly trust engendering. Behaviors, in the United States, people tend to behave as if they trust the system quite a bit, despite any friction in the system and so on. And here is the kicker in the pants. Attitudes. You ask Americans, do you trust the system? Do you trust digital payments? Way down the scale. So that's the state of trust. I could pause here. I could go on. Jonathan, I'm looking to you for direction. The second, or this final section that I had here was another massive piece of work that we did where, really went down to the county level in the United States. And we sort of said, look, the United States is not one country. In fact, it's the disunited states digitally. We're very different depending on where we live in terms of digital experiences. And digital payments and digital trust and digital financial services vary depending on whether you live in Shelby County, Tennessee, or whether you live in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. And depending on your state of digital readiness in the United States, that has a profound impact on your state of digital trust, because our digital trust varies massively depending on where you are. So I can share some of that learning, or I could pause, turn to you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think let's pause for a few minutes, Bhaskar, and have some questions that came out of what you've been presenting. Thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through that research, in particular, understanding really the digital landscape with respect to evolution momentum and how digital trust layers into that, I think, is fascinating. One thing that I was just thinking through as you were presenting on this is, what is the role of institutions in really bolstering trust, or maybe breaking it down? I saw some research recently from Edelman Trust Index, I believe it was, that came out about businesses being globally really a leader currently in terms of being trusted organizations vis-a-vis governments and nonprofits. So would love to have your thoughts on institutions and trust building.
Yeah, of course, as we all know, institutions play an enormous role in trust building. But the follow-on question that I would hope each one of us asks after this discussion is, what kind of trust are we talking about? Are we talking about the Edelman kind of trust, where Edelman goes and asks Jonathan, hey, Jonathan, do you trust Bank of America? Jonathan, do you trust MasterCard? Jonathan, do you trust Venmo? And Jonathan says yes, no, or whatever on a scale of 10 to 1, you say something. But then when I look at Jonathan's financial records, what you'll find is what he does is very different from what he says. That's one. Second is, how trustworthy is the system, is the ecosystem that PayPal is using, or how trustworthy are all the technologies behind, fraud detection, cybersecurity, authentication being used by the transaction companies like MasterCard or Visa or whatever. So now the answers to these questions are very different. So institutions play an enormously important role. And as we know that consumers are quite finicky. Consumers, they roll up and down the trust curve based on the narrative within which they live. And sometimes the narrative is also relative. So what do I mean by that? Which is in an environment where I'm losing trust in government, business tends to do better, because where else am I going to go? People say, well, the public sector ain't delivering, so here I'm going to go there. And there was a time when people used to trust the technology companies. In fact, at the start of the pandemic, before we kind of went into this tunnel, the institution of big tech was having a trust crisis, because there was this rising storm about misinformation, what's happening to my data, is there cyber hacking, people's credit card information was out there. And then we went into the pandemic, and suddenly guess what? I can't live my life without Zoom, or, even if I'm a frontline worker, my kid is at home and I have to get on the computer to, download the school homework, or I have to get on my computer to get my stimulus check. And suddenly people's trust in the digital systems actually went up. And then it started going down. And by the time we went into the close of 2020, it was really at rock bottom. So we see people's trust kind of go up and down, but institutions matter a lot. And you can see it's not just institutions. These days, of course, those institutions have a human face. So if the institution is big tech, quite often it is like an individual. And if the individual shows up and looks uncomfortable in a congressional hearing, my trust level in that person actually goes down. Or if that person, comes across as confident and cool, you can see the trust level go up. So it's kind of, yeah, of course, institutions play an enormously important role. But beyond the cosmetic aspect of institutions, they have a very, very important role in terms of the substance. Are they embedding the right technologies in place? Are people's experiences proving that they are doing the right things? Or do they recover really fast every time there is a breach of trust, which sadly happens all the time? There's a data breach, and then how quickly has the institution come back and said, yep, we've caught this, you're okay?
Kind of along the same lines, with respect to government in particular as an institution, do you think it's, I guess, have you seen good examples of where government can help instill more trust, or maybe examples where it's taken it away? And kind of a follow-on to that is there an opportunity for business to come together and create some of those standards? My wife is a nurse. She works in hospitals. They have the Joint Commission, which is a nonprofit that helps set standards around all sorts of different things. So would love your thoughts on those too.
Yeah, of course, governments are, the institution that, historically we have turned to, for trust on a broad set of parameters. And I keep coming back to the pandemic simply because, it sort of taught us so much. And of course, this was a time when we all had to turn to governments, because ultimately, that is not just the last resort, it's also the first resort for how one, somehow survives, through this horrendous period in human history. And, governments failed. Governments failed. They fell flat on their face across the board. And I'm sorry, I'm not even talking about the US government. The US government failed miserably. It sort of is on a pathway back, certainly. Right now, we're living through an absolute horrendous catastrophe in India. I'm on the phone continuously all day right now, trying to manage, a government failure in India and people looking for a hospital bed or an oxygen cylinder. People have outsourced healthcare in India to social media. Same thing is happening in countries like Brazil and other parts of the world. So governments have failed. Where have governments done well? New Zealand, my favorite country. It was my favorite country before the pandemic, post-pandemic. Oh my God, if we could go to New Zealand, I'd just stay there. So New Zealand, of course, you could say, well, New Zealand is a special case. It's a total outlier. It's out there on the corner of the planet. They can seal themselves off, but they also showed how government could work. They had the Prime Minister of New Zealand standing side by side with her health minister and her finance minister, signaling that, look, we want you guys to go into a total lockdown. And I've got the health person and I've got the finance or economy person to signal that I understand that this is an economic loss to you. I understand that you are going to, you might lose your job. But I also want to signal that we have robust mechanisms to allow you to continue to work and continue to make payments, receive goods, and do transactions. So I do believe that governments and also individuals, the persona of government, is super important in engendering trust. And then I'll just make one more comment. People, their trust levels don't remain constant, right? So if you take the example of, say, a country like Germany, did an enormously terrific job in maintaining trust in government through the 2020 period of the COVID response. And then when you went into the phase of the vaccine rollout, that trust level just kind of dropped. And and of course, many other dynamics going on there. So one can't take trust for granted. You have to keep working at it.
If I can drill in very specifically to some legislation that has been passed around privacy and whatnot, I know that in the EU, the GDPR is alive and well and has really helped push this phase of open banking that's been driven by government. And you have in California, the CCPA, which is doing something similar here in the United States. Kind of bringing that to mind, is that an effective way for government to address those privacy concerns that consumers have? Or does it just go back to resting on kind of that leadership, that persona that you were mentioning with respect to government and how they present themselves?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, of course, how they present themselves is important, right? Because we trust, and we're human beings ultimately. We look at somebody in the eye, and even if their face is masked, but I want to be able to look you in the eye, and somehow I'll gauge, am I making a connection? So that really matters. But ultimately, substance matters. If the substance isn't there, I could look you in the eye, and if I don't get the experience I'm looking for, the trust is going to be broken. So behind the persona, you need to have the systems in place. So I absolutely agree that data protection laws, privacy laws, and forward-looking laws are really, really, really important. Forward-looking, that's critical. And sadly, I don't think we are there yet. I don't think we're there yet. So if you think about GDPR, everybody talks about GDPR, which is great. I think the Europeans have done the world a favor in kind of stepping out ahead of everybody else and kind of saying, okay, we're going to take leadership in providing that scaffolding and that guiding framework for how data is collected and used for the next generation of digital industry, as it were. But at the same time, there have been many failures there, which is you could put laws in place, but then what about human behaviors? That wasn't quite taken into account. So if I am in Europe, if I open the same website that I open over here, a whole bunch of boxes will pop up. And what am I going to do? I'm just going to hit continue, because I want to get to my app. That's what most people are doing. So the fact that I'm just saying continue doesn't necessarily mean I'm saying, hey, take my data and do whatever you want with it. I just want to get to where I want to get to. So it's not just enough to let people know. It's kind of like that, the radio ads that come in which say, hey, Jonathan, I've got a deal for you. And then the rest of it, the caveat, is said at such a speed that there's no way for you to ever catch up, with the. So that's the equivalent of the lack of human-centered, data privacy and regulation that is potentially something we have to overcome. I don't think it's an easy thing to take care of. Then the other set of issues that we still don't have a handle on is what do we do once we get past the foundational data protection laws and regulations, and then start thinking about regulations that protect us in a world of AI. And when we think about AI, of course, a very broad umbrella, covers many different things, but let's just use that label for anything that is, you're basically taking a bunch of data, sticking an algorithm in front of it, and then letting the data flow through the algorithm, and there's refined information that comes out of the other side, which becomes a new product or service informed by the data. Now, what comes out of the other side could have problems from an ethical standpoint. It could have problems in terms of a bias because the data is historical. So if it's only one ethnic group or one gender that has populated the data at this end, that's going to completely skew what comes out of the other end. So the future just looks like a reflection of the past. So how do you change all those things? We still don't have a handle on that. And then what we don't have a handle on is coming back to the pandemic. How private is your data? The fact that I am COVID negative or COVID positive, should that be private information? Should that be public information? In South Korea, it's public information. Guess what? You're COVID positive. It's not a private health problem. It's a public health problem. So off you go. It goes there. China, you're not allowed entry into a building if you stick your phone on with a QR code. If it doesn't shine up green, you can't get in. So how do we strike the right balance between private use and public use? We still haven't figured this out. Finally, there's so much we haven't figured out. I'll note one more thing. The data, Jonathan's data, does Jonathan own that data? Mm-hmm. Can he monetize that data? Instead of having a digital company monetize it, should we actually give Jonathan ownership of the data? Well, that's a tricky ground to cover because we don't quite know which part of all of this is Jonathan's data. So right now on my screen, I see Jonathan and Bhaskar, two people on the screen. Now, this image belongs to whom? Actually, probably belongs to Akoya. So you guys have it. But it's arguable in an Instagram post where it's posted by Jonathan, but he's got like 5 friends in there. So how do you separate the co-ownership of data is stuff that we still haven't figured out. And then ultimately, how do you should you regulate companies, or should you create incentives for them to do the right things in terms of data? Because the government can never keep up with the technology. You have to rely on the Dorseys, the Zuckerbergs, the Pichais, and every other digital genius in the world to be a responsible steward of our data. We're never going to be able to follow all of this. So do you create penalties? Do you create regulations, or do you actually set up the right incentives? We still haven't figured this out. This is a long journey. It's a complicated issue. And I think we collectively need to be thoughtful about this. And maybe the solutions are more local. You identify in vertical areas or certain horizontal applications where you set up different rules. But I don't think GDPR is the end of the story. It's just the prologue.
That's a great response, Bhaskar. As you were talking, I was thinking about a New York Times article I saw about a year ago that was following President Trump through his phone and locations he was going in. And the question, I think, becomes, even for somebody like the President of the United States, is that data private? Is it public? Who owns it? Et cetera. It seems, as you were talking, that especially when we start talking about things like clicking through, that cookie box I get when I go to a British site, or my terms and conditions, it seems like there's an element of literacy that's important here, or maybe just knowledge at a basic level. I mean, I think about when my phone, my credit card got changed out, and all the apps that are assigned to that one credit card, it took me, I don't know, 3 hours to reset it all. And it just amazed me how my data promulgated, or just how it was all over the place on my phone. But there's an element of literacy. I mean, I didn't even think about what was on there. I was just wondering if you could spend a couple minutes on that. And just real quick for the audience, if you have questions, please send them in. We do have a couple coming in, and I'll start asking Bhaskar those here in a minute.
Yeah, so Jonathan, the question of literacy is such a huge issue. So when we think about cyber breaches, a significant portion of cyber breaches happen because of problems on the consumer end, as opposed to from the institutional or the provider end. When we think about misinformation, which has been a topic of a huge concern in recent years, whose fault is it? Is it Mark Zuckerberg's fault, or is it my fault that I'm clicking on a stupid link that has been passed on by a friend? So I think my propensity to believe a random post that comes on a social media platform varies depending on a bunch of parameters. How digitally proficient, how digitally literate am I? And I don't want to sound elitist, sitting here in the Northeast of the United States, kind of saying, hey, these people are more digitally literate and those people are less digitally literate. But the reality is that there are some very clear correlates. Digital literacy and digital proficiency varies depending on your income level. And this is true at a global space, right? And what you saw in those digital maps, digital trust mapping that I showed you earlier, very quickly ran through, which is countries that are relatively new to the digital ecosystem, they're a lot more trusting in their behaviors. Because for them, the alternative is, if I'm a consumer in China, I basically use, one platform for doing, it's like a Swiss Army knife or a Chinese Army knife for everything, right? And so I use it because it's so convenient and it gets everything done. The alternative was, this physical thing which didn't really work. So people are basically trusting the system with a bunch of things because they're excited about the new technology and they jump into it. The more mature a society gets in terms of digital usage, the more skeptical they become. And they start asking questions. That's why you saw the United States, people, their attitudes are much more skeptical than people in the developing world. Then education levels matter. This has been studied quite significantly. The more educated you are, the more sophisticated a user of digital technology you are. So demographics matter, income levels matter, education matters, and sadly, politics matters. So depending on where you are on the political spectrum, the further to the extremes you are, the more vulnerable you are to getting misinformed by digital information coming out. And I can keep going. You can actually map different parts of the world, in fact, different parts of the United States in terms of vulnerability to digital literacy and lack thereof.
Fascinating. I assume that ties in as well with your county level analysis and whatnot. It's absolutely fascinating. We have a question from the audience. Does it prove out that a lower trust environment correlates to a lower usage of financial systems digitally?
So I'd come back to the questioner when you say lower trust environment, but trust measured in what way? Is it trust in the environment? Is it trust in the experience? Is it trust in the attitude? Or is trust in your behaviors? So I'll give you an example. In an environment where consumers say, I don't trust the system, that doesn't necessarily mean that people don't use the system frequently. Great example, United States. Typically, consumers in the United States are much less trusting when you ask them in an Edelman survey. But when you look at usage, they are using digital apps and fintech applications quite a bit, and much more so than you would imagine based on the attitudinal information that you've got.
The behavioral element is fascinating to me. And you had said something about that earlier. In particular, it just made me think about whether people are actually trusting what they're doing, or it's required, especially given COVID. I cannot go, or I could not go and sit down in a restaurant. I had to order out. I could not, or did not feel safe to go into a grocery store to get groceries if I'm elderly and have a comorbidity or two or things of that nature. It seems like there's definitely the behavioral aspect versus my perception of it can be drastically different.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know if there's any other questions from the audience. Feel free to drop them in as well. I can keep lobbing softballs at Bhaskar and whatnot. One question I had for you, Bhaskar, was what innovations, especially over the last year in particular, have you seen that are really exciting to you, that you're seeing that are really driving forward trust, maybe in any one of those elements that we've discussed to this point, but anything that stands out in particular?
Well, to me, I think, ultimately, if you can create a trustworthy experience for consumers, that will eventually find its way into everything, because people learn, from their experience, and that sort of forms their belief systems. So innovations that engender trust in the experience space, and then that ties to the environment, because my experience is a combination of my perceptions and what the institutional environment is providing for me. So I see, innovations in authentication, innovations in fraud detection. A lot of that, depends on sophisticated data analytics and, running algorithms on, a combination of my own and other behavioral data to then detect patterns, which could identify unusual activity without being annoying. So you don't want a situation where every time you're in a new town, you have to call your credit card company, or you have to call them in advance, letting them know that you're traveling. So I see that as kind of one important, innovation, as it were, in terms of building trust in financial systems. I also see innovations in human-centered design. So making stuff really easy to use. You just, boop, do that, and people say, "Wow, that's amazing. Is it done?" Yeah. And contactless payments have become so much more easy to use in the last year and the last few years. So that's been another major innovation that I think. And these are small things, but they make such a massive difference in terms of people uses. But this is a lot of these are sort of first world innovations. I think innovations that then integrate many different human activity. Are interesting issues to consider. And just day before yesterday, a team in one of my classes did an analysis of an enterprise called Banco Mare. It's based in Brazil, and essentially they use blockchain technology to enable financial payments on an app. And the target customers are people who are living in the favelas of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, and for many of those people, it's an interesting choice between kind of going to this relatively new application and trusting the system. At the same time, kind of the part of the appeal is that it is sort of using this crypto system which no one really understands. But people say, well, it's going to keep everything secure. The government is not going to be bearing down on you, and your information and your financial security is guaranteed. And at the same time, there are companies like WhatsApp, which is the most popular social media messaging app in the favelas. They're getting into payments. So I find that dynamic really interesting. I find that is an innovative process by which we are trying to reach the unbanked, the new layer of financial services customers. I find that fascinating, how we reach them and really understand their context, their concerns, their reasons for distrust, and build that empathy into the model, build that empathy into the design, build that empathy into the technology. Really, really important. Finally, one other innovation, which is sort of a little bit further out, but it's one of those things which everybody seems to find kind of fascinating, is just crypto itself. So because there's a lot of concern about the value of the dollar, and of course, given where we are in terms of fiscal, the state, there would be some concerns about, what might happen in the future with the dollar. So, you can see a shift towards, an interest in crypto. And simultaneously, you see the central banks now getting worried. Are we going to lose control over a section of the economy? So genuine interest in digital currency coming from the central banks. We've already seen China, take a leap forward. Central banks around the world are looking at this issue. I find that another fascinating area of innovation and a competitive dynamic that will really transform the financial landscape in the decade to come.
Great answer, Bhaskar, and thank you for that. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. I found your discussion of the favelas, though, as a quick note before we go off and have to leave. The underbanked problem is something I think we could unpack for a very long time, but being able to instill trust in that type of population, I think, is a fascinating challenge, and one that applies, I know, here in the United States as well. Thank you so much, Bhaskar, for taking the time with us today to walk through digital trust. If you're looking for an international business degree, I could highly recommend one at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. Again, Bhaskar Chakravorti, thank you so much for the time today. It's always a pleasure to spend some time with you, and great conversation. Look forward to having more of these in the future. Thanks so much. And everyone
Absolutely,
else,
Jonathan.
have a great afternoon and evening.